Some mysteries stick with you. They're the cases that detectives can't shake even years after retiring. The kind of stories that make seasoned investigators wake up at 3 a.m. still wondering, what if we missed something? Tonight, we're diving deep into two unsolved cases that are so strange, so haunting. They'll make you question what you think you know about coincidence, fate, and the darkest corners of human nature. These are real cases involving violence against real people, including a child. We'll handle the details respectfully and focus on the investigative aspects. But please be aware of the sensitive nature of what we're discussing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. February 28, 1983. St. Louis, Missouri. Let me paint you a picture of St. Louis in the early 1980s. The city was struggling. Unemployment was high. Entire neighborhoods were being abandoned, and beautiful old Victorian houses were being left to crumble. Clemens Avenue was one of those streets where grand homes from the 1800s had been chopped up into cheap apartments, then eventually abandoned altogether. It's a freezing Monday evening, temperature hovering just above zero. Two men, Thomas Dockery, 33, and Robert Miller, are doing what a lot of people did during those tough economic times, scavenging for scrap metal to sell. Old houses like the one on Clemens Avenue were gold mines for copper pipes, brass fixtures, anything they could salvage. The electricity had been cut off months ago. The only light came from matches and a small flashlight with dying batteries. They'd been through most of the upper floors already, finding the usual debris of urban decay. Broken furniture, water damage, graffiti. Then they decided to check the basement. Thomas Dockery strikes a match, and in that brief flicker of light, he sees something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. There on the cold concrete floor was the body of a young African-American girl, between 8 and 11 years old. She'd been decapitated, her small hands tied behind her back with red and white nylon rope. She was wearing a yellow V-neck sweater and white socks on her tiny feet. Dockery later told police he stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. Then he and Miller ran to the nearest phone to call 911. Detective Lieutenant James Murphy was the first investigator on scene. Murphy had been with St. Louis PD for 15 years, had seen plenty of homicides, but nothing had prepared him for this. He later described it as the most professionally disturbing crime scene of his career. What struck Murphy immediately wasn't just the horrific nature of the crime, but how carefully orchestrated it seemed. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. Someone had planned this meticulously. Within hours, the investigation was in full swing. You'd expect the phone to start ringing immediately. Frantic parents, worried teachers, concerned neighbors reporting a missing child. Missing persons units were put on high alert. Local media ran the story prominently, asking anyone with information to come forward. But here's the thing that baffled everyone. No one reported her missing. Think about that for a second. An 8 to 11-year-old girl disappears from somewhere in or around St. Louis, and nobody notices? Nobody calls the police? It seems almost impossible in a city of nearly 500,000 people. Detective Murphy put together a task force of 12 officers. They canvassed every school in a 50-mile radius, showed her description to every teacher, principal, and school administrator. They checked with social services, visited every children's home and foster care facility. They interviewed hundreds of people. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed. The police called her Little Jane Doe and started analyzing every piece of physical evidence they could find. What they discovered made the case even more mysterious. First, there was almost no blood at the scene. The medical examiner determined she'd been killed elsewhere and her body transported to the basement. But why there? The building had been abandoned for months. How did the killer know about it? Did they have some connection to the property? The basement itself told a story. It had been recently swept clean. Not just cleaned, but methodically swept. Someone had spent time removing evidence. Investigators found broom marks in the dust, indicating the cleaning had happened within days of the body being discovered. The yellow V-neck sweater she was wearing became a crucial clue. It was a children's size medium, relatively new, made of a cotton polyester blend. But here's what was strange. Someone had carefully cut out all the manufacturer labels. Not torn out in haste, but precisely cut with scissors or a knife. Someone didn't want her identified through her clothing. Detective Murphy worked with textile experts to analyze the sweater's construction and materials. They determined it was likely purchased from a major retailer, Sears, JCPenney, or Walmart, within the previous year. But without the labels, it was impossible to trace. The rope binding her hands was equally puzzling. It was standard nylon rope, red and white twisted together, available at any hardware store. The knots were simple but effective, not the work of someone with specialized knowledge, but someone who had taken time to ensure she couldn't escape. Dr. Michael Graham, the chief medical examiner, conducted the autopsy. His findings were both heartbreaking and mystifying. Despite the horrific circumstances of her death, Little Jane Doe showed no signs of long-term abuse or neglect. Her teeth were in good condition, suggesting regular dental care. She was well-nourished, at a healthy weight for her age. Her fingernails were clean and trimmed. Someone had been taking care of this child. The decapitation itself was precise, done with a sharp instrument, likely a knife or hatchet. Dr. Graham noted that whoever did this had some knowledge of anatomy, or at least had taken time to make clean cuts. This wasn't a frenzied attack. The investigation generated hundreds of tips and potential leads. Everyone was followed up on, no matter how unlikely it seemed. One early theory was human trafficking. In the 1980s, awareness of child trafficking was just beginning to emerge. Investigators wondered if she had been brought to St. Louis from another state or even another country, which might explain why no one locally reported her missing. They contacted the FBI, who ran her description through national databases. They reached out to police departments across the Midwest and South. They worked with immigration officials to check if any undocumented families might be too afraid to report a missing child. Another possibility was ritual murder. The precise nature of the decapitation, the careful placement of the body, and the fact that her head was missing all suggested to some investigators that this might have been part of some kind of occult practice. They consulted with experts on cult activity and ritual crimes, but nothing matched known patterns. The case got its biggest break in 1985 when police arrested Vernon Brown for the murder of 9-year-old Janet Perkins in a different part of St. Louis. Brown was a 34-year-old man with a long criminal history stretching back to 1970. He'd been in and out of prison for assaults, burglary, and increasingly violent crimes against women and children. What made him particularly interesting to Little Jane Doe investigators was his employment history. Brown lived just 4 blocks from the abandoned house on Clemens Avenue where Little Jane Doe was found. He would have been familiar with the neighborhood, possibly even known about the abandoned building. Detective Murphy brought Brown in for questioning about Little Jane Doe. The interview lasted 6 hours, with Brown initially cooperative, but becoming increasingly agitated as questions focused on the 1983 murder. Brown denied any involvement with Little Jane Doe. He claimed he couldn't remember where he was on February 28, 1983, and had no explanation for why he might have been in that area. His alibi was weak, but there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. While Brown would eventually be convicted and executed for 2 other murders, forensic testing could never conclusively link him to Little Jane Doe. Hair samples found at the scene didn't match his DNA, and fingerprints on the rope used to bind her hands weren't his. Over the years, several other suspects emerged, each bringing hope for a breakthrough that ultimately led nowhere. In 1987, police investigated William Hayes, a maintenance worker who had done odd jobs at various abandoned properties around the city. Hayes had a history of breaking into vacant buildings and had been seen in the Clemens Avenue area in early 1983. However, when questioned, he had solid alibis for the time period when Little Jane Doe was killed. Another suspect was Robert Morrison, a janitor at Beaumont Elementary School, who disappeared shortly after the body was discovered. Morrison had a history of inappropriate behavior around children and had been fired from previous jobs for similar reasons. Police tracked him to California, where he'd moved immediately after leaving St. Louis. Morrison agreed to questioning, but denied any knowledge of the crime. And again, no physical evidence could connect him to Little Jane Doe. Perhaps the most promising lead came in 1994, when Linda Foster, a former funeral home employee, came forward claiming she recognized the description of how the decapitation was performed. Foster said it matched techniques used in mortuary science, and she suspected a former colleague named David Kellerman might be involved. Kellerman had worked at various funeral homes in the St. Louis area and had been fired from at least 2 positions for erratic behavior and possible theft. When investigators tracked him down, they discovered he had died in a car accident in 1989. His former employers confirmed he had the skills to perform the type of precise cuts found on Little Jane Doe. But with Kellerman dead, the lead went nowhere. As the years passed and the case grew cold, Detective Murphy, now retired, never stopped thinking about Little Jane Doe. When DNA technology advanced enough in the early 2000s to potentially help identify her, he pushed the department to reopen the case. But even this scientific breakthrough led to heartbreak. Little Jane Doe had been buried in Washington Park Cemetery, a historically black cemetery that had fallen into serious disrepair during the 1990s. Poor record-keeping, flooding, and general neglect meant that by 2003, investigators weren't even sure exactly where her grave was located. It took months of painstaking work, consulting old burial records, and using ground-penetrating radar to locate what they believed was her burial site. The exhumation was conducted with great care and respect, attended by several of the original investigators and members of the local community who had adopted her memory. Mitochondrial DNA testing revealed that she likely originated from somewhere in the southeastern United States, possibly Georgia, South Carolina, or northern Florida. This was consistent with migration patterns to St. Louis during the late 1970s and early 1980s, when many families moved north seeking better economic opportunities. The DNA results were entered into national databases, compared against missing persons reports from the Southeast, and cross-referenced with genealogical databases as they became available. But even with this advanced technology, Little Jane Doe remained unidentified. 40 years later, the investigation continues today. Little Jane Doe's case file occupies an entire cabinet in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Detective Sarah Chen, who inherited the case in 2015, estimates she's reviewed over 10,000 pages of reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses. Chen has brought new techniques to the investigation, including advanced DNA analysis, facial reconstruction technology, and social media outreach. In 2020, she worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to create an age-progressed image showing what Little Jane Doe might have looked like, hoping to jog someone's memory. The case has generated renewed interest through podcasts, documentaries, and social media campaigns. Every few months, Chen receives new tips from people who think they might know something. Each one is carefully investigated, though none have led to a breakthrough yet. Every February 28th, a small group of people gather at the site where Little Jane Doe was found. Some are retired officers who worked the original case. Others are community members who have adopted her memory. They leave flowers, say prayers, and renew their commitment to finding her name. The questions that continue to haunt investigators: who was she? How does a child disappear without anyone reporting it? What kind of person could commit such a calculated crime against an innocent child? And perhaps most chilling of all, has whoever did this killed again?